Hello, I'm Stephen Clarke, your MC and moderator for today's live streamed Ceres 2020 event and the Director for Corporate Clean Energy Leadership at Ceres, sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies from around the world on a host of global sustainability challenges, including water risk, both scarcity and pollution, the climate crisis, and deforestation. I'd like to start today by saying that our hearts go out to all of those seriously affected by the global pandemic. And we are especially grateful to those on the front lines, risking so much and working hard to ensure we all stay as healthy and safe as possible. I also want to thank each of you for participating. We realize that your personal and professional lives have been profoundly disrupted in ways really quite unfathomable just weeks ago. But your unflappable commitment and courage shown by your participation today is truly inspiring. The generous commitment and support of our speakers and sponsors who stood by us on this digital journey to reimagine Ceres 2020 is so appreciated and must also be highlighted. We clearly would not be here today without your essential support. Somehow, against the odds, we were able to transform our intended in-person convening into a digital program together. The profound commitment and conviction of so many in our community to address the dual existential threats that are plaguing our global community is inspirational. With new awareness of the systemic risks, if global temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius, investors, companies, and policymakers have begun making commitments to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. In today's session, participants will explore how major asset owners decide to begin aligning their portfolios with 1.5 degrees Celsius, compare corporate strategies to set and meet ambitious carbon reduction goals, and evaluate the critical role of policymakers in enabling deep carbon emissions reductions. Before we begin with today's session, limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, roles for investors, companies, and policymakers, I have a few housekeeping notes. First, please note this session is being recorded. We will provide all participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box that is located on your control panel. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Please also note there is a potential that due to global bandwidth issues, we may experience some challenges. Unfortunately, this is beyond our control. If it does happen, the discussion will pause for 30 seconds to allow for bandwidth to readjust. We want to thank you ahead of time for your patience in the event such an issue arises. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speakers, each of whom has been a leader and at the vanguard of working with investors and companies to take action on climate. We have Michael Frerichs, Illinois State Treasurer, Cynthia Cummis, Director of Private Sector Climate Mitigation at the World Resources Institute and the Science Based Targets Initiative, and Jeff Hanratty, an Applied Sustainability Manager with General Mills. I also want to invite all of you who are participating in this webinar to complete the poll, which will come up on your screens momentarily, and we look forward to reviewing your answers during the next few moments of our session. You'll see in this poll 3 questions asking about your familiarity and experience with science-based targets. So it'll be up on your screen for approximately 20 seconds, and then we'll jump into questions for our panelists. Great. Appreciate everyone's cooperation here and lots of responses coming in. This is fantastic. All right. With that, I can quickly review. I believe you all should be able to see these poll results, but it looked like 90% of you are familiar with science-based targets. 7% of you responded that your company has an SBT, and about 21% of you said your company is actively considering a science-based target. So thanks again for completing that poll. That's very helpful. And I would love to start with a question for all of our panelists today. Our Ceres CEO, Mindy Luber, wrote in a recent Forbes column about the need for leadership to prepare for and deal with complex and global crises and heightened risks, known as gray rhinos. A gray rhino is a term coined by risk expert Michelle Walker to describe highly obvious, highly probable, but still neglected dangers, as opposed to unforeseeable and highly improbable risks known as black swans. Mindy wrote about two types of gray rhinos facing humanity now: the novel viruses rapidly spreading deadly infections around the world, and the slow burning problems of the climate crisis, which have boosted global temperatures, caused ocean levels to rise, and have led to an increase in extreme weather events. How are each of you and your respective organizations balancing the near-term demands of dealing with the devastating ongoing pandemic with the need to make immediate and far-ranging progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And maybe we can start with Treasurer Frerichs.
All right, Stephen, thank you very much. Let's just start off by saying climate risks are not going away. As government agencies and investors pursue efforts to recover from this economic downturn, and it will be difficult, they should not lose sight of the climate crisis. We have continued to factor in climate-related economic and financial risks. Investors increasingly face compounding systemic risks from a rapidly warming planet that challenge their ability to deliver long-term returns for the beneficiaries. We believe that climate transition strategies represent a major economic opportunity for businesses and investors. Many businesses recognize that transitioning to net zero can create significant new employment and economic opportunities. As businesses and investors look at paths towards recovery, there are exceptional growth opportunities in the development of new sustainable assets. You know, I think there's been a lot of bad news lately, but some of the good news coming out of this is I think that people are seeing some of the changes in the environment out there and they're liking them. And I think they've seen new ways of working together to address these big risks. Addressing climate risks helps build resiliency, both for business and investors. We think an accelerated transition to a net zero economy in line with the Paris Agreement is critical to increasing resilience and will enhance the ability of businesses and communities to absorb both acute and systemic shocks. The world's response to COVID-19 should be a wake-up call. Now, we're acting fast as a civilization, trying to flatten the curve and avoid mass suffering and death. We recognize that this is a moment of historical importance. But in fact, we've already been living in a moment of historical importance. Global warming is staring us in the face just as much as COVID-19, and we need the same kind of rapid, all-hands-on-deck approach to avoid the catastrophic impacts of unchecked climate change.
Thank you, Treasurer. Very compelling points there. Cynthia, anything to add on that sort of balance between dealing with this near-term public health crisis and climate change?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to say it's just been really encouraging to see that we get the rate of participation in the Science-Based Targets Initiative continues. We are getting many more companies over the last couple of months to make a commitment to set a science-based target, and we are continuing to validate targets at the same rate before the pandemic. So we're really encouraged by that commitment that we're seeing from companies, that they're still staying committed to following through with their science-based targets. And they clearly understand the need to address the long-term challenge of climate change in parallel with addressing the COVID pandemic. And in that vein, I wanted to mention that the SBTi has been reaching out to all the companies in the initiative and asking them to sign on to a statement to reaffirm their commitment to their science-based target, and also to commit to advocate for an economic recovery that is in line with the transition to a low carbon economy. we'll be releasing that with a group of CEOs in the initiative in the next few weeks. Yeah, and yeah, we hope to have most of the SBTi companies on board.
That's great. It's very encouraging to see that continued commitment from the companies. Jeff, speaking from the company perspective, in what ways are you and the team at General Mills balancing the near-term need to deal with the virus along with the compelling need to continue to make progress on the climate front as well?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, everybody, and appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. Well, as a food company, we're making as much food as we possibly can to supply our customers whose demand has increased because people are just shopping more, they're eating at home more, and so it's been a boon for our business to try to make as much as we can while trying to keep our employees safe, which has been a challenge. And I'm proud to say we've been able to do that, and a lot of food companies have been able to step up. But there's also been opportunities. And then in terms of climate, this is probably going to have a significant impact on our footprint, if you will, because we're running as much as we can. We're buying as many ingredients as we can, and a lot of our footprint is in that ingredient supply chain. But we're still committed to our climate targets. We're very committed to farmer resiliency, and that's really been our focus: is how can farmers be more successful and contribute to climate solutions and still have a profitable business. And that is really where we're continuing to focus. Now, we've had less farmer meetings. There's more virtual meetings, but we're still completely committed to getting those farmers enrolled in regenerative agriculture. I can talk more about that later, but that's really been our focus.
Thank you all. And each of you touched on the tremendous risk that inaction on climate change poses across the entire economy, investors, companies, and the like. And I'd love to ask Treasurer Frerichs, how does your team evaluate climate risk in its portfolio?
Great, Stephen. Well, let me start by saying climate risk is pervasive and systemic. It presents material risks to nearly every industry we're looking at. SASB research demonstrates that 72 out of 79 industries are significantly affected in some way by climate risk. Now, this type of systemic risk cannot be diversified away. As a result, investors must employ a range of strategies to manage climate risk, such as balancing exposure through sector allocation, focusing exposures on best-in-class securities, and actively engaging individual companies on key climate-related factors to encourage enhanced disclosure and performance. Climate risk by nature is diverse. It manifests differently across different industries in the form of physical risk, regulatory risk, and transition risk. So let's run through a few examples here. Agriculture companies. Extreme weather events, heat and humidity can materially affect the industry's production efficiency and supply chain. And I'm guessing that Jeff can probably talk about that. Commercial and residential real estate. Sea level rise and increased storms are expected to have significant consequences on coastal property and infrastructure. Oil and gas companies are an obvious one. The need to properly value reserves in a carbon-constrained world and be prudent about capital expenditures. Commercial banks also suffer. Lenders must effectively manage the carbon embedded in their loan portfolios. So how do we evaluate climate risk in our investment portfolio? Materiality and relevance. And we consult other organizations such as SASB. We integrate risk considerations using 3 pillars of our sustainable investment framework. And those are in our internal management, the funds that we oversee ourselves; external management, those managers who oversee the funds we're responsible for, like college savings or retirement savings. And we engage in active ownership. I'm happy to talk about any of these 3 in the rest of the program.
Thank you, Treasurer. And building on that, the Treasurer highlighted some compelling risks across all the sectors. and rationale for companies to act. Cynthia, I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate on the reasons why a company, maybe even a fast-growing prominent company, should pursue an SBT. Is an SBT an obstacle to growth and expansion, or is it an opportunity, as the treasurer mentioned, for more economic growth and for companies to prosper?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, we have many fast-growing companies joining the initiative. And for example, we have many of the companies in the initiative are from the food sector, the apparel sector, retail sector, and IT, which all have a number of fast-growing companies in them. And I'd say the reason they are joining is really they understand the future. They have customers, suppliers, investors, employees that are more and more calling on these companies to be leaders, and they understand that to have a license to operate, they're going to have to take action and take ambitious action. They all are working to figure out how are you going to decouple growth from emissions, and that's the challenge they have. But if you look at the companies with science-based targets, the majority of them have these absolute emission reduction targets, even in the face of fast growth for many of them.
And Jeff, as Cynthia mentioned, some of the opportunities for many of these companies that are setting science-based targets, could you talk some more about how General Mills went about setting an SBT, one of the first companies to do so, a real vanguard in that space?
Yeah, and so, what I've realized, tying it back to the COVID situation, is people don't feel it until they feel it, right? And so it's hard for folks to feel climate change and understand it, and they can't just be told about it. And I think it was the same thing with COVID. No one really worried much about it until they were told to stay home. And all of a sudden it's impacting you personally. And us as leaders, we have to figure out a way to make people feel climate change and help them understand it. And I don't know that just telling them and having stories really gets that. We have to help them feel it. Now, I'm not suggesting anything super drastic, but we need to help them understand it. And in times of crisis, leaders need to lead. And we see a way to do that is by setting a science-based target. And so sticking your company's proverbial neck out there and saying, we are committing to a science-based target. And what really started it for us is back in 2014, we had a bad Q3. We had to report, bad earnings, and it was just a bad time for a public company to say things are not going well. And one of the items that our CEO mentioned during that earnings report was 62 lost plant days. We lost 62 operational days at our manufacturing plants due to interruptions due to extreme weather events like the treasurer just talked about. And so we counted it. We could tell you how much 62 plant days is worth. It makes it very, very real. And the leaders of our company got on board and said, we can't have this. This is an impact to our business that we just cannot have. What can we do about this? And of course, that was our opportunity to say, yes, climate change is real. Here's the impact of your business. Here's what we need to do. And so we started working on a science-based target. One of the things that I found that was easier about a science-based target as opposed to our past targets that we'd had in place since 2010 of reducing energy in our plants, which resulted in reducing greenhouse gas, was it was hard to set a target because you didn't know how much you could get. Science-based targets does that for you. It's based on science, and you can blame science. And it's nice to blame science when you go to a leader in your company and they said, well, how did you come up with a 28% reduction over the next 10 years? I said, well, that's what science is. That's what Mother Nature needs of us. They're like, well, how are we going to get there? It doesn't matter. That's what that's what Mother Nature needs of us. And maybe that's not the best argument, but it makes it a lot easier to help leaders understand that we're not making this stuff up from a sustainability point of view. it really helps us do that. And yeah, and so I'm proud to say that we had one of the first approved science-based targets back in 2015. Now it's 5 years. We're looking at that again, to see, how we can change that up, improve our science-based target, looking at 1.5 degrees C, et cetera. But really, I would encourage any company that the very first thing you can do is set that target, even if you don't know how you're going to get there. There's plenty of ideas and folks out there that can help you do that. And when we set our next goal, we're going to have a clear map on how to get there. When we set our first goal, we didn't. And we've just learned so much through working against that science-based target.
It's really exciting. Yeah, General Mills has really played quite the leadership role in really setting the trend there and setting these targets. And it was exciting to hear how internally that worked, how there was real internal motivation to encourage the company to step up on that front. Investors can also play quite an influential role from the outside. And I'm wondering if the treasurer might be able to speak to what role investors can play in encouraging companies to pursue science-based targets, and then maybe also elaborate some more on those three pillars you had highlighted in terms of actions that your team is working on the climate front.
The role we can play is immense. Institutional investors own about 80% of the US equity market. Now, among those equities, pension funds are the largest asset owners. So we find ourselves among this group, particularly among public pension plans. So as sizable, significant owners of publicly traded companies and major clients of the biggest fund managers, we have a significant role to play if we choose to play it. Now, we do this by direct engagement with companies. Now, first, consider our role in directly engaging companies on climate risk and SBTis. When we own a share, we are partial owners. Now, through a wide variety of engagement methods, we have the ability to call on companies to develop and disclose their emissions reduction targets. Well, let's talk about a couple examples here. So pushing for decarbonization of the US electrical utility industry. In February of last year, 2019, we joined the Net Zero by 2050 Investor Coalition. This coalition is engaging the 20 largest electric utilities in the US to obtain commitments to achieving the net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Net Zero by 2050 group has sent letters, engaged in dialogue. We filed related shareholder proposals, all in a push to have these companies commit to the goal of net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. To date, we are pleased to report that 6 companies, including Duke Energy, Xcel Energy, NRG Energy, DTE Energy, Pinnacle West, and Dominion Energy, have committed to net zero by 2050. Now, I said earlier, we also work with fund managers. We directly engage with them. So it's critically important that asset owners engage with their fund managers to ensure that they are working towards these same goals. It's one thing to put it in your own investment practices, but if you don't communicate that with your fund managers, if you don't hold them accountable, you're not going to have great results. An example there was engaging with Vanguard on its climate-related proxy votes. So earlier this year, we filed a proposal at Vanguard asking the company to assess its proxy voting record and guidelines related to climate change. Reports indicated that in 2019, Vanguard only supported 7% of shareholder proposals on environmental and social issues. Given the risks posed to investors by climate change, we believe that managers have a responsibility to revisit their proxy voting policies to ensure alignment with today's marketplace and to fully consider the importance of science-based targets as materially impacted companies. So discussions with Vanguard are ongoing, and they have tentatively agreed to issue case studies that provide further transparencies into their voting rationales. It's a step in the right direction, but we still have a lot more work to do.
That's fantastic. Congratulations on the great progress with the utilities. It's really encouraging and really exciting to hear how companies are motivated to set these science-based targets, whether it's internally, as Jeff highlighted, or as you mentioned, Treasurer, having encouragement from investors. Both avenues are yielding tangible results, as Cynthia flagged earlier. When it comes to implementing these science-based targets, when companies are looking to actually reduce emissions, I'm wondering, Cynthia, if you might actually be able to discuss what are some of the successful strategies companies have used to implement science-based targets?
Yeah, so keep in mind the initiative was launched in 2015, and the first targets are just coming due at the end of 2020. So we're still trying to get a better sense of whether companies are meeting their targets and how they're meeting their targets. I don't think it's a great mystery about how most companies are meeting their targets, especially around scope 1 and 2 emissions. I think they always, companies will start with energy efficiency measures, improving the efficiency of industrial processes, fuel switching, all those things that companies have been doing for a long time, and then moving to purchasing renewable energy products, and then moving on to really rethinking their business models, and what we're hoping that this very ambitious target setting will drive is companies really thinking about the whole consumption, their consumption models, and thinking how that they can move maybe more to more service models or other types of business models that reduce consumption of resources. One interesting survey we did last summer was of we're trying to get a better understanding of scope 3 target setting, and are those targets really leading to emission reductions? Because these targets scope 3 targets are very new for companies. So we did a survey of the more than 200 companies last summer that had validated scope 3 targets, and we got a response from nearly 100 of them. And one of the questions we asked them is, are you meeting your target? Are you on track to meet your targets? And the majority of them said yes, or that they were at least making progress towards the target. And then we also asked them, what are the key actions you're taking to achieve your scope 3 targets? And so the actions that made the top of the list were reducing business travel, not surprisingly, promoting energy efficiency with your suppliers, working with suppliers on supporting them to purchase renewable energy, and then replacing raw materials, moving from more carbon-intensive raw materials to less intensive raw materials, increasing recyclability of their products, and then redesigning their products to increase the energy efficiency throughout the life cycle.
Interesting. Thanks, Cynthia. Lots of options there for companies looking to tackle scope 3, and looking forward to hearing more from each of you on the scope 3 challenges. Jeff, are there specific challenges and opportunities that General Mills encountered after it set its science-based target, in terms of exploring ways or some of the strategies that Cynthia flagged to reduce emissions? And I know General Mills is in a fairly interesting sector when it comes to emissions from agriculture and land use. So I wonder if you might be able to talk about some of those issues that arose when General Mills set its science-based target.
Sure. And so our science-based target is a 28% reduction of our scope 1, 2, and 3 absolute emissions between our fiscal year 2010 and 2025. So it's over a 15-year period. Proud to say that currently we're at about 14%. So we're about halfway, although we're more than halfway there on time. We're about halfway to our goal, while we've grown our company's sales by 13%. So down 14 while we've grown the company. So that's exciting news that a company can grow its top line while improving its carbon bottom line, if you will. Where we found, kind of like Cynthia said, where we found the easiest way and the best way is wherever we can save money. Doing good for the environment does good for the bottom line in a lot of cases. And so where we've been the most successful is energy savings projects, capturing waste heat from our heating processes. It used to be that one of our executives would say they would come over the hill to one of our largest plants, and if he could see that steam coming up out of the stacks, he knew things were running well and we were making food. And that's not the case anymore. Our goal is not to emit all of that steam, it's to capture that heat and reuse it in the processes. And we've had, great success doing that. And if, like I've said, of course, that, saves us money, of course, dependent on the price of energy. Where we also have been successful is in logistics and how we deliver our products and how we get our ingredients delivered to our manufacturing locations. And so that's a combination of improving fuel economy. We don't own any trucks, or very few, if any. That's all through contracts and through agreements. And by putting in expectations around fuel economy into contracts, we're improving our footprint, and we're saving money, and our suppliers are saving money and getting better and improving the fuel efficiency of their vehicles, their trucks, et cetera. And at the same time, we're focused on, well, how do we load trucks differently? How do we work with our supplier or our customers to get them pallets of cereal and soup on the same pallet? Because soup is really heavy. You cannot fill a truck up with soup without overloading it. And if you fill a truck up with cereal, you're underloaded. So how can we get better at mixing products? And so that's a challenge for a big company, because we don't make soup and cereal at the same place, right? We make, cereal in Georgia and soup in Missouri. And so how do we get those two products together and get them distributed in the most efficient manner? So we've got really smart people working on that, but that shows up in our carbon footprint, and we're really excited about that. Another way that I won't say that we had a big influence on, but the types of products that we make. And so over the last several years, we've made more snack products like Nature Valley products than we have dairy products like Yoplait. And when we make a snack product and we do the cooking and it doesn't require any refrigeration and it's very light, that's low intensity as far as GHG is concerned, as compared to, yogurt that requires refrigeration all along the way. It requires refrigeration in people's homes. We count all that as part of our footprint. So if we can, and I just want to be clear, we don't decide that. Our customers decide what they're going to buy, but we can always make sure that when we're developing products, we're looking at how can we cook more of it, if you will, and do more of that work, because we're just much more efficient at cooking things in large quantities than a consumer is in their own home.
Kudos to you and your team, and congratulations on that great progress. Those are significant logistical challenges, and it's really impressive to see how far your team has come in a relatively short period of time in tackling some of those emission-related issues. A question back to the treasurer. You had mentioned focus on the utility sector in some of your recent work. Are there other sectors that are of interest to you and your team moving forward? The utility sector historically has been a very high emitting sector, but transportation has become an increasingly important sector when it comes to emissions. As recently as in the last year or so, has become the leading sector when it comes to emissions. So wondering if there are other thoughts from you in terms of other sectors of interest or companies, groupings of companies that might be of interest to your office.
Yeah, I talked about the energy sector because I think that's low-hanging fruit. But as I said earlier, climate change is something that affects almost all industries. You can't just focus in one area. 72, I think, out of 79 different industries, according to SASB, affected. And so we take a similar approach that we did with energy sector with others as well. Now, there are limited resources in our office. The successes we have had have really been a result of a team effort. And we'd really like to have more of our peers joining us with these, because when there are more of us together who own a larger percentage of shares in these companies, we have greater leverage and we're more likely to be listened to. And so we would encourage peers to join us in these efforts.
Great point. No, and we'll be looking to hear more from you as to how your peers, what kind of lessons learned some of your peers might be able to pull from some of your activity. But before jumping into that, I have a question following up on something Cynthia flagged earlier in terms of Scope 3 emissions, and wondering if, Cynthia, you have some additional thoughts as to what role might corporate policy advocacy play in a company meeting its science-based target?
Yeah, I mean, since the very beginning of the initiative, one of our goals was to use the SBT companies as a way to influence policymakers about the level of ambition that could be achieved. And we were intending or aiming to use SBT companies to influence the ambition of the nationally determined commitments of various countries. Now that we have like a critical mass of companies in a variety of countries, we are hoping to put that goal into action, and that's one of the things we hope to do over the next year is do more mobilization of companies to influence policy. So both to raise send a message to policymakers about the level of ambition that can be achieved, so that they have the confidence to raise the ambition of the NDCs, and that gives companies more confidence to then make additional investments in reducing emissions, this ambition loop concept you've probably heard of. We also want companies to start sending a message to policymakers about what policies they need to be put in place, or what incentives they need to put in place so that they can achieve their science-based targets. So I guess there's like these two pillars of advocacy that we're hoping to help enable over the next few years.
That's great. Thanks for updating us on that. And it sounds like policy is just an incredibly important part of what you mentioned, the ambition loop, in terms of companies both setting and then meeting those science-based targets. And wondering, Jeff, if you might be able to speak some more about Scope 3 in particular. This is an issue which we hear about from a broad swath of companies around the challenges around Scope 3. And wondering, Jeff, if you might be able to speak to some of General Mills' thinking around meeting Scope 3 targets and what some of the unique challenges and opportunities are there.
Right, yeah, thank you. So for our particular company, probably 15% of our footprint is really in Scope 1 and 2. And so the rest of it is Scope 3, which we don't control. And I always have said, if everybody in the world had Scope 1 and 2 goals, I wouldn't need to have Scope 3 goals. But that's not the case. So, I got to work on other people's stuff if they're not going to work on it from a Scope 1 and 2 target setting point of view. And so that's what we're set out to do. And so if you look at our particular value chain, and I would direct you to our global responsibility report for a whole bunch more information. But when you look at our value chain, about 50% of our footprint is upstream in ingredients, and about 20% of our footprint is downstream in people using our products and storing our products and buying our products, and everything from driving to the store, and lots of different factors. And so where can we have the most influence? Well, that's probably upstream. And so for us to impact our real footprint, all I said before in our successes that we've had, it's not enough. It's not enough, and the IPCC has confirmed that. And so we have to do more. And for us to do more, we can't just work on Scope 1 and 2. Now we've invested in green power and wind power, and that's going to drive our Scope 2 emissions, virtually or net to zero, with our most recent RE100 commitment. But again, that's not going to get us to our science-based targets. So we're working in agriculture. And so last year, we committed to advancing regenerative agriculture on 1 million acres of agricultural farmland in the U.S. supply chain. And that's really where we're betting, placing our bets, is that the farmer is going to fix climate change. And we're, and as I mentioned earlier, we're working on, it's not just about, the farmer storing carbon, it's about the farmer being resilient and having a profitable business. And oh, by the way, they're also, restoring soil health and reducing water issues and storing carbon in the soil, and really really just getting back to improving that soil. And when you improve soil, you really get that carbon where it needs to be. And we need to, come up with ways to make sure it stays there. But to do that, if you're going to ask someone to solve your issues, or society's issues, we got to make sure they get paid for it. And so how do we make sure that there's a reward for farmers? So when you go back to policy, we just don't have a value. There's very few companies in this world. And actually, I was just on a webinar before this where Microsoft was talking about their internal price on carbon and how they valued carbon, and they tax themselves based on their choices. And that's great. And we're looking at that. And can we do that? But just if a few companies do it, we're not going to be successful. So, again, as I said earlier, leaders need to lead, and we need to make people feel climate change. Well, a way to make people feel climate change is to value carbon. And so hopefully, once we value carbon, then those that are storing it or reducing it, foresters, farmers, et cetera, can be rewarded through that value proposition. And so we're working on that. We see that as an exciting place to try to lead.
Thanks, Jeff. It's hard to think of another sector that's more at the located or situated more at the front lines when it comes to both of the gray rhinos, right? In terms of all of the supply chain disruptions from the pandemic, as well as being vulnerable to extreme weather events on the climate front. So it's really exciting to hear that ambition from General Mills. Shifting back to the treasurer, your office has really been a tremendous national leader when it comes to climate and investor action in 1.5 degrees Celsius. What actions can some of your peers take to also lead on climate, and are there particular resources or institutions that have been helpful in your activity?
Sure. Just as Jeff said, a couple of companies doing it aren't going to make a big difference. A handful of investors aren't going to make a big difference either, and that's why we encourage our peers to participate. But sometimes if you're just starting out, they don't know how to begin. So we like to give a few clear examples of things they can do. So first off, integrate climate risk into your investment policies. It's nice to have an idea in your head, but if you don't put it in writing for other people to see, they don't necessarily know that, or they don't know how committed you are to it. But then, if you can, designate particularly teams in your office to be responsible for the evaluation of climate risk. It's one thing to say we're going to consider it. It's another one to have someone dedicated to that. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Someone needs to be measuring what's going on. You need to engage with companies and industries facing daunting risks to push for greater disclosure and performance. We think in politics, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And we think that if companies are offering greater disclosure, you're going to find better solutions out there through crowdsourcing. We want our peers to engage with fund managers to better understand their evaluation of climate risk and how they incorporate science-based targets into their processes. So we don't oversee everything out there. We outsource a lot of this. We want to make sure that the managers in charge of this understand it's important to us. We look at their investment analysis, their company engagement, their proxy voting, amongst other things. And they need to know they're going to be held accountable if their actions aren't in line with our policy. We think it's also important for our peers to review their proxy voting policies to ensure alignment and attentiveness to issues related to climate risk and science-based targets. So if anyone is worried that that sounds like a lot, we don't experience this, what can we do? Don't fret, there are allies out there. There are several resources that can be helpful. So one is Ceres. I'll make a plug here, an outstanding organization that can assist with investment analysis, best practices, engagement, and many other areas. Ceres is not alone. The Climate Majority Project is a nonprofit organization focused on climate risk issues. They help to coordinate the Net Zero by 2050 initiative and are pushing for board-level accountability on climate issues. A group that I mentioned, SASB. SASB provides a framework for evaluating material risk factors by industry, identifying relevant sustainability topics that companies should be reporting on. And they also have a technical bulletin on climate risk that we think is superb. The Investor Agenda is the collaborative initiative that provides investors with a set of actions they can take in 4 key areas: investment, corporate engagement, investor disclosure, and policy advocacy. And there's also a carbon disclosure project. CDP provides an exceptional reporting framework for companies with detailed lines of sight into emissions and SBTs. So don't worry, join the effort. You will have allies out there, we'll be stronger together, and there are a lot of resources out there to help you along the way.
Thank you, Treasurer. That was excellent. Great call to action, and I greatly appreciate you framing out so many very helpful and wonderful resources for folks who are looking to engage and be impactful. That was fantastic. I think we'll go to one more question for Cynthia before we open it up to a few questions from the audience. And wondering if Cynthia, you might be able to speak to how might science-based targets and the Science-Based Targets Initiative change in the near future to adapt to new economies and other issues that might arise as increasing amounts of companies are looking to set science-based targets.
Okay, yeah, so building off of Jeff's comments around challenges in scope 3 emissions reductions, I wanted to mention just what we're finding from a number of sectors is a variety of the challenges that companies have in reducing scope 3 emissions can only be addressed through massive collaboration, collective action. And we're just learning about how companies either don't understand, they don't have enough transparency to even understand who their suppliers are, or they're switching suppliers often, or they only buy a small portion of products from a supplier, which reduces their leverage. And without this like massive collaboration within sectors and across sectors, we won't be able, companies are gonna it'll be difficult for many companies to achieve their scope 3 targets. So I think supporting companies or thinking about platforms, frameworks that we can develop to support companies to engage in collective action is one thing that we're thinking about as the next phase, as one of the next phases of science-based targets. Some of the other new things that we have coming out is around the financial sector, building off what Michael's saying. Like the financial sector plays such an important role in financing the transition to the low carbon economy. They need to be setting science-based targets themselves around their portfolios. A financial institution, can't just be setting science-based targets around their operations because their main impact on the climate is in their investing and lending activities. So we have 54 financial institutions with a commitment to set a science-based target, but we haven't been validating those targets because we needed to go through a process to think through what's the right framework for financial institutions to set science-based targets on their investing lending portfolios. And we've been working on this for the last year, and we plan to launch the first version of our framework in September, where we'll enable financial institutions to set science-based targets on 5 different asset classes, and we'll be expanding that over time. Just like the whole initiative, it's really a work in progress, and we learn as we go. We just don't want to prevent action now. Even if we don't have for the financial sector, I don't think anybody has the best solution on what the right metric or strategy we want to see coming from them to support the transition to the low carbon economy. We want to make sure financial institutions are taking action now, and we'll evolve the system over time and learn as we go. And then the one other thing I'll mention is our work on net zero target setting. Right now, we have had a primary focus, a sole focus on these 5 to 15-year targets that are actionable and create accountability. So the 5 to 15-year time frame that we think is most critical. But we also see this growing interest in companies and financial institutions in setting these longer-term net zero targets that we want to support and provide clarity on the link between SBTs and net zero. So we've been going through a stakeholder process now to define what net zero means for companies, and next year we'll start thinking more about what net zero means for a financial institution. And we want to start validating next year these long-term targets for net zero as a supplement to science-based targets.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. You have your hands full there with a lot of very key and impactful work coming up for the SBTi, and it'll be exciting to see how each of those frameworks and the net zero work plays out in the near future. So very exciting. It looks like we've got quite a few questions from the audience, and I wish we had some time to get into all of these, but I think we will jump into one or two before we wrap up. And I'll start with one that we hear a lot from companies on, and that's on the question around offsets. So I'll read this one from the audience. Maybe we can start with Jeff's answer, which is, how do you regard the value of offsets in achieving a science-based goal? Is acquiring and retiring potential emission sources as good as actual reductions?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying the ultimate goal is to reduce emissions first, and then look to what else can you do. Offsets, we've started using the word inset. We're really focused on trying to improve emissions within our supply chain, and we're engaging with a number of parties, but we're part of a group that WRI is leading on a rewrite of the GHG accounting standard on land use change, et cetera. And so that's where we see a lot of opportunity, but we would still suggest that it needs, for a science-based target anyway, it still needs to be tied to your footprint and your activity. And there's a lot of opportunity for identifying those and getting after them. But net zero, that's, I think, where offsets really will serve a place. And how do we get to net zero? Because net zero, the word net is an accounting, I won't go too far, Treasurer, but is an accounting word, right? And so you're doing a math exercise to say I'm at zero. And to do that, you likely will have to find something potentially outside of your supply chain, such as an offset. But I would say reduce first, and then find the improvements that you can get within your supply chain that might be more of an inset, and then lastly find some offsets. But it's not a matter of buying your way out, but there's places where you can invest that might be more of an inset than an offset.
Don't worry, Jeff, I'm
Jeff.
an investment officer, not an accountant.
Okay.
Do either the treasurer or Cynthia have additional thoughts on offsets?
That's a really important question, and one we continue to think about and will elaborate more on in our net zero work. But based on the IPCC special report on 1.5, they've made it clear that most companies need to fully decarbonize by 2050 or earlier, and some will have residual emissions, and we see a role of investments and removals to balance those residual emissions. But for most companies, the goal has got to be focused on fully decarbonizing. We see this growing interest in companies claiming net zero more in the near term rather than just in 2050. And for those targets, we are thinking about, for companies that want to go beyond 1.5 emissions reductions, decarbonization, to claim net zero, what could the role be in offsets? And that's something we want to elaborate on in our net zero guidance that will be coming out over the next year.
Yeah, I'd say in the Treasurer's Office, we've made great efforts on reducing our electric consumption, whether it be with changes in our computer technology or a new building we're moving into and retrofitting that to significantly reduce our energy needs. But I can claim great credit over the last 8 weeks or so in a reduction of our travel budget and carbon from that. That's been a lot out of our control, though.
Great, thank you all on the offsets issue. And just to wrap it up with one quick question, I know we're quite short on time, but if Congress were to pass a carbon pricing mechanism tomorrow, would that obviate the need for companies setting science-based targets, and vice versa? If we have the majority of major companies in the US setting science-based targets, does that obviate the need for a price on carbon? Curious as to all of your thoughts on that, maybe starting with the Treasurer again.
Yeah, I'll say that would be a good step in the right direction, but I don't think it would do away with all need to be looking at that. I'll defer more to my panelists here. I am also the chair of the College Savings Plan Network, and we have our monthly executive meeting starting in a minute or two. And I'm the chair of that, so I'll be hopping off shortly. But thank you for the opportunity to talk here with people attending this series webinar. I found it very helpful, and hopefully they have as well.
Thank you,
I
Treasurer.
think I'm going to disappear now.
Any other thoughts from Jeff or Cynthia on carbon tax before we wrap up?
I just think it depends on what the policy is. If it's a tax versus carbon trading and how much of the economy it covers. I think policy is critical, and there's a major gap there that voluntary programs have tried to fill to some extent, but can never fully fill. So, but I think there will continue to be a role for voluntary programs as a supplement to policy.
Great. Well, thank you all for this tremendous session. I wish we had more time. The amount of experience, leadership, lessons learned, and some views into what's coming down the pike has just been fantastic from all of you, and really looking forward to continuing the dialogue as we continue to take action in spite of these major challenges we're facing on the public health and the climate front. So I want to thank all of you for taking part in today's session. Before we adjourn, I wanted to take a special note to thank all of the sponsors that you see on the screen who provided instrumental support for Series 2020. Please note that you will receive a follow-up email with a recording of this session shortly. For those of you who are part of Series 2020, another session on conservative case for climate action and clean energy will take place tomorrow, May 6, 2020. To register and to learn about our other upcoming sessions, go to www.ceres2020.org. I want to thank Cynthia, the treasurer, and Jeff again, and we're going to wrap this session up. Thank you all, and stay healthy and safe to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.